Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 13th week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Aram and Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen in honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I also can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Chomsky has remarked that, quote, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people a sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of debate. Close quote. That's what's going on in American politics today, with a lively debate provided by Republican and Democrat parties. But what are the presuppositions of the system that are being reinforced by the limits put on that range of debate? There are principally two: neoliberalism and neoconservatism. Neoliberalism is the conscious campaign by American business elites to reverse the democratizing trends in the American economy from the New Deal through the 1960s. Neoliberalism supports the limitation or abolition of social supports, which they call entitlements, like Social Security and Medicare, deregulation of business, including manufacture and finance, and promotion of the so-called private sector's role in society. Private sector means rich people, the 1%. Neoliberalism wants to limit democratic control of economic activity and have government protect the role of corporations around the globe. They call that free trade. Neoconservatism, which is not opposed to neoliberalism but just concerned with a different area, advocates the assertive promotion of democracy and the American national interest in international affairs, principally by means of military force. But in this case, democracy means U.S. political control, and the American national interest means the worldwide economic interests of the American rich, the 1%. As the playwright Tom Stoppard says, war is capitalism with the gloves off. Of course, neoliberalism is capitalism with the gloves on, to pick your pocket. After a generation of intense political activity by the business elite in America, both Republican and Democrat parties are now neoliberal and neoconservative. The Democrats were thoroughly colonized beginning in the Carter administration, and the Republicans stopped being an ordinary political party altogether and became a radical insurgency who've abandoned any commitment to parliamentary democracy. Their goal for the last few years has simply been to undermine anything that Obama might do in an effort to regain power and serve their primary constituency, which is the very wealthy and the corporate sector. They try to conceal this. You can't get votes that way, so they had to mobilize sectors of the population which has always been there but were never mobilized into an organized political force. Evangelical Christians, extreme nationalists, terrified people who have to carry guns into Starbucks because somebody might be after them, and so on and so forth. That's a big force. Inspiring fear is not very difficult in the United States. We have a long history back to colonial times as an extremely frightened society. And mobilize people in fear of them, whoever them happens to be, from ISIS to black people in Missouri, Russians to Iranians. It's an effective technique used over and over again. And right now, the Republicans' non-policy has succeeded in putting them back in a position of at least congressional power. So their personal attack on Obama is simply part of that general effort. Meanwhile, Obama has attacked 8 countries from the air and continues to conduct the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. He's killed thousands of people with drones, including hundreds of children, while he pretends that he's ending wars. What's the answer? We need to bring all the troops home and provide a good job at a living wage for every American who wants one. But that probably can't be done within the spectrum of acceptable opinion in the U.S. today. So you're watching News from Neptune, a Limits of Allowable Debate edition, where our format is to take turns suggesting stories that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes if not often even innocently, in the corporate media, and then ask our colleagues to comment on them. And Ron Szoke has the first story.
Yes, well, I think there's a lot more to be said there. I want to return to that business, especially this recent proposal to privatize the University of Illinois itself. So we'll get back to that, especially I think when David Green is here. But there were some interesting articles in the New York Times discussion columns this week. Thomas Edsall, who generally writes very interesting stuff. How poor are the poor? And there's a continuing stream of narrative from our conservative and right-wing friends pointing out that the supposed poor are better off than ever. And in some absolute sense, this seems to be true. They have a lot more things than the very poor did a half century ago. But what is the relevance of that? So we have to begin distinguishing between absolute and relative poverty, or what's called inequality, I think, and start thinking about what is the position within the society of the people who are very poor. And this becomes a conceptual problem. Again, this whole area of discussion is pervaded by conceptual problems, vagueness, misconceptions, and so on. And I would like to think that I can contribute something to the clarification of these problems, part of my long-term project that I call cognitive hygiene. But the definition that he proposes that everyone stick with, that is Mr. Edsall, who's a professor apparently of journalism at Columbia, if your income is below half the median, then you should be counted as poor in every country. So it will be a relative matter then. But figure out the median income, that is, half of the incomes in the society are above it, half are below it, and then take half of that, and that would work out to about somewhere between $11,000 and $12,000 a year in our society today. Whether that should count, again, as poverty depends, because some people will point out that it costs a lot more to live in some places in this country than in others. But we have to stop somewhere making assumptions and muddying this up with possible exceptions and other ways of looking at it, and so on. So that would do for me, but of course it's constantly under attack by conservative thinkers, scholars, who will point out that the poor are better off today than they have been in the past. So I'll come back to that again and again, I think, because it's a big problem. Robert Skidelsky, professor in England, who wrote in Project Syndicate, wrote about some related problems. He's the biographer of Keynes, by the way. In Messed Up Macro, the place of beliefs and expectations in macroeconomics. And the problem there in getting any kind of conceptual clarity and building a constructive theory is that current conceptions of what counts in economics is a lot of talk about expectations and assumptions and so on. And it comes down to theories about what one person's expectations will be about the expectations of another person and so on. So you get into this hall of mirrors that makes everything indeterminate, he says, and it's impossible to come up with a coherent macroeconomic theory that will deal with this situation. This is what leads Paul Krugman to talk about the confidence fairy. Everybody is trying to figure out how much confidence everyone else has in the viability of the system, and that becomes endless. You're endlessly chasing your tail about who is assuming what and expecting what and so on. And some people are very pleased to keep it that way and to promote that kind of confusion and indeterminacy. But anyway, there are certain things that we can point to in the short range that seem fairly definite. One is that oil prices are now up sharply since the Saudis began bombing Yemen. And what are the consequences of that going to be for the various oil producers around the world, and for the USA in particular, and in particular the 1%. So I'm not too clear on that, but I think we'll come to that, back to that. The final thing that I want to suggest is the business of privatization. And if my colleagues want to return to that theme, I think it deserves some more explication. This week, it appeared in the newspaper that one ex-legislator in this state has proposed the privatization of the University of Illinois itself. So are we going to abandon the land grant idea because that looks too much like socialism, or what? So I'll just leave that as a provocation at the present.
Thank you very much, Ron. Takes on any of this, Karen, from poverty, how poor we all are on average, so to speak, or anything else?
Okay, yeah, well, comments on what Ron has been talking about. Okay, number one, that the poor are better off today than ever were. It's just so ridiculous a statement to make that I won't even bother to address it. It's outrageous.
You're talking absolutely or relatively?
No, relatively. If you
Are you absolutely poor or relatively poor?
Right. Either way.
Are your relatives poor?
Well, no, but we have a declining middle class. We know that. The poor have been poor for a very long time, but the middle class is becoming poorer and poorer all the time. And when you have people, so many people declaring bankruptcy, so many people without medical health care, and the cost, it's the cost of living here. And I can honestly say, when I returned to live in America after my years in Asia, most of my friends in Asia thought I was nuts. And I'm not talking about Asians. I'm talking about Americans and Europeans. And the main reason, besides the fun, the chaos, and the color sometimes it's an adrenaline high, but nonetheless, it's the cost of living. Even with Medicare. Now, you can get Medicare in other nations, okay? But let's see, or is it Social Security? Yeah, we don't get Medicare out of the country. Out of the U.S., Medicare does not cover you. It's still cheaper to live elsewhere and go and pay cash up front without having any health insurance at most establishments, okay, throughout. And as far as people saying, oh, well, healthcare in Asia, it's not that good. I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have wealthy people from all over the world going to places like Bangkok, and I know that for sure.
Right.
So, if you've got money, Singapore is tops, absolutely tops. And Hong Kong is also very good. Now, if you don't have a lot of money, you'll go to Southeast Asia, and as I said, Bangkok is now a #1 place. I'm hearing and reading that India is also. But anyway,
we've seen the rise of what's called medical tourism. It's cheaper to have a number of procedures done. You can fly there, have it done, have a 2-week vacation, fly back, and it'll all be for less than what a certain procedure, such as a hip replacement, will cost you.
Precisely. So, to anybody who says that, we have it better today, only the upper 1% does. And some who are in the upper middle class, that are making, you know, good money or made good money and have invested it. But that's really where the money is in investments, not in earnings. We know that. I want to jump over to something else Ron said. Now I can't remember exactly what it was. But like I said, even people today, or most foreigners, once you've lived elsewhere in the world, you really question coming back here to live. If you're of, especially if you're of the retirement age, it's the students and the young people who come here, and then people like me, when my daughters are here, so I have to be on the same land mass. And now it's too expensive to go somewhere else. But anyway, I was actually going to talk a little bit about intervention with your discussion of Yemen. Like, I don't think the price of oil, since the U.S. doesn't get our oil from the Middle East, it shouldn't impact on us. But I don't know, you can probably address that better, Carl.
Put that aside for, I'd like to comment on the point that you just raised, though, about this this business of the cost of living in the United States, and what rather peculiar article, I thought, by Thomas Edsall put up trying to decide who was really poor. I mean, it seems to me, on the face of it, rather odd to say, well, we'll figure out poverty by finding what the median income is and then looking at the people who don't come up to that, because the question of whether the median income provides what you need or not is not solved.
Right.
If the median income does not include a living wage, so to speak, then everybody who falls below it and everybody who makes it is poor in one sense. Yeah. To figure out poverty on the basis of what you need to live would seem to me to be a much more reasonable way to do it, and that's why the notions of a living wage have been constructed quite reasonably, it seems to me.
Well, it needs to be nailed down somewhere, and what you need to live is subject to individual judgment. For example, there's been a law proposed in Missouri, I think, that people on food stamps should not be allowed to purchase seafood.
Yeah. This is madness, because seafood is a luxury from this view, I suppose. And they should eat gruel, like Oliver Twist, rather than have a nice fish dinner. But I don't know. I'm sure we'll have objections from Red Lobster and so forth, to that law. But corporate concerns may take that away from us. But back to this notion, I thought the more interesting statistic in this matter that came out this last week was the fact that there were almost no cities of any size in the U.S. where someone working for the minimum wage, working full-time for the minimum wage, could rent an apartment.
Right.
I mean, now there's a question. There's a question of poverty, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that it's far better to try to construct your notions of poverty on the basis of what it costs to live, rather than what everybody else is making. And
well, I'll even bring up the subject of property taxes. My house is paid for. It is not an expensive house. It's less than $100,000. But if my daughter wasn't earning a good living and willing to pay my property taxes, I'd probably lose my house. I don't know. I mean, so, it's, so I have to get a job. But bottom line, we think of paying property taxes as being an equitable means of taxing people, but even that is subject to question for a lot of people who are elderly or on fixed
Well, some are now
incomes.
saying it's an indirect way of taxing wealth.
yes.
Yeah.
And there's something to that,
There's
obviously.
something to it, yeah.
I mean,
if you have a lot of property and an expensive house, then of course. But I don't have a lot of property, I don't have an expensive house, but still my income as a retiree doesn't cover my property taxes. So, but as I said, so I look at other people who are in what I would call worse shape than I am, and I have to question how they would manage if we only use that as a means of taxing.
This issue actually might even obtrude into the, as far as I can tell, issue-free political campaign for mayor of the neighboring city. In Champaign, the candidates for mayor don't seem to distinguish themselves one from another. Don't seem to distinguish themselves much at all, but they don't distinguish themselves from one another very much on the basis of what they would do as mayor, in part because the Champaign mayor doesn't do very much, but constitutionally. But the difference that did appear fleetingly was this question of taxes, property taxes that you raised, Karen, where at least it was said that some or another, one or another of the candidates preferred to use property taxes in the sense that they approached wealth taxes, as Ron said, rather than consumption taxes, that is sales taxes, which are necessarily regressive. They're regressive in the sense that the poor pay them, the rich pay them, and they pay the same. So it's
and especially for food. I mean, when
exactly.
you tax food, when you have a sales tax on
that's
food,
right.
To me that is the most unfair. That is the most inequitable because everybody has to eat food.
Sure.
You know.
And
so,
Well, what if they're eating lobster?
yeah, exactly. The people
They're
in
gonna pay higher
Missouri,
taxes.
they can stop. They can stop. You know,
can't imagine that they are.
Dictate what you can buy at the
Right.
supermarket. That's what I say. The question of taxing property rather than taxing consumption seems to me to be a reasonable one because it goes in the direction that Ron mentioned. That is, it goes in the direction of wealth taxes. And that certainly has been the way that we've been trying to talk about taxes on the left in this country for a while now, that wealth should be taxed, tax should be based on ability to pay, and we should not tax the what you need to live. And therefore, the first thing to decide is where you begin the taxings, the taxes of wealth. But it's a question that's not being debated on that level. It's being debated on the seafood level. And,
I mean, make no mistake, I'm not opposed to paying property taxes because I recognize what they cover, education, a lot of the absolutely necessary services. So I'm not opposed to property taxes, but I'm concerned, like for instance, this medical school that Carl is setting up that I've been hearing about. If they end up taking and increasing property taxes, there are people like myself, retirees who are unemployed and have limited income, Social Security, etc., that will not be able to afford the property taxes.
I
So
see that
that's-
as the opening wedge in this business of the privatization of the entire university.
Right, right.
It'll be called nonprofit at first, but then that will gradually be eroded also.
Well, just to make myself clear on privatization, I'm opposed to all privatization of everything and anything. We know that one of the goals is to privatize the postal service, which to me is absolutely nonsense. Do we really think that FedEx and DHL and their competitors will not raise their fees? Because privatization is like all the mergers we've had. I mean, I could not believe when I was still living overseas, I'd hear about these mergers, and I kept saying, what happened to our antitrust laws? We don't use antitrust laws anymore. So here again, it's all just pushing it up the hill to the 1%. So the consumer, if you're a capitalist, you should want to have competition, but we don't even have. I'm not a capitalist, but even for those who are true capitalists, there's no competition anymore. So we the consumers are at everyone's mercy, literally, when they privatize.
Yeah, the form this appears in now is the debate over the charter schools.
Oh, that's another one, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And they're destroying the public schools as well, as a result, precisely.
So you underfund them, then point out how badly they're doing, and then we need to have charter schools and keep out the teachers' unions.
That
so
really,
we're learning everything.
That's a perfect example, Ron, really.
This is quite shameful. I'm not sure whether the charter school debate, which is about primary and secondary schools, of course, the charter school debate is really the same debate about the privatization of the university.
No.
I mean, in fact, if you look at the structure of university education in this country, the first thing you see is it contrasts sharply with the rest of the world. In this country, we have public and private universities, so-called, but can you really tell the difference to them difference between them as you look at them? Students go in differently to public and private universities, and even though they're told that the public university is usually cheaper than the private university, even that's not true in the sense that the forms of economic support for students in private universities are often greater than those in so-called public universities. So it's a distinction without a difference for the most part in regard to the student. More sharply invasive of the student's life is the system of financing, which leaves students now with a tremendous burden of borrowed money when they leave the university, whether it was public or private.
Right.
And that's an amazing change, a change that's taken place in the years that I, now retired, was an active university professor. And the change is very great. The universities that I started teaching in 35 years ago are very different from were very different from the universities that exist right now. And the student debt overhang is the biggest difference. That's not true of foreign universities, and it's something that we really are going to have to deal with pretty soon. Student debt in this country is now greater than credit card debt, I'm told. This is astonishing. And we have to realize that one of the things student debt is a way to keep students docile. That's the reason that there's a willingness to put up with this system in the American universities system. You have to have lived through it to realize how shocked American universities were by the 60s. I mean, this was something that didn't happen in America. It happened in other countries.
Right.
And the way they have found, in almost evolutionary sense of handling that, is debt peonage. Put students in a debt trap. Tell them, they need that degree. They have to borrow money to have that degree, and they owe that money when they come out, and they better not foul up because they've got to find a way to pay that debt.
Don't rock the boat.
Exactly.
Here's what we're looking at, though. I mean, I can remember feeling somewhat superior because in America, everyone could get an education. We had the community colleges. We had that option, as where Europeans would say, I mean, a lot of the Europeans I knew had not even gone to college. They just finished up at age 16. They didn't have the option. Some of them had gone to good private schools. They didn't need to go, to be quite honest. But my point was that we felt somewhat superior. But now, with the increasing cost, it's just the opposite. People can't go to college today or get university education unless they have plenty of money. And here's what I'm predicting with the privatization, say, of the University of Illinois. Currently, a land grant student, that means somebody who's from the state of Illinois, pays approximately $34,000 to $38,000 per annum a bachelor's degree student, okay? But a foreign student comes in and he pays almost double that. Because I calculate, at the time, it was just written up recently in the Daily Illini, I think, a foreign student was saying that, they were talking about the pricing of education. He will pay, let's see, the land grant student will have approximately $80,000 worth of debt for his bachelor's degree, as where the foreign student is apt to have something like $155,000. So the foreign student is only going to come here if he's really got money, okay? But if you privatize the university, think of the money they'll be making. Who do you think they're going to let in? Who do you think they're going to go after? They're going to go after those foreign students because they have to pay so much more, and the university then becomes even more of a profit-making industry than what it is today.
It seems to me that to talk about privatizing university is primarily a way to deflect demands that universities actually serve the public in a more reasonable fashion, in part by keeping their costs down. You can say that to a public university because it has this land grant dimension to it. It's supposed to be educating people in that way.
Yeah.
If you don't have that lever, you can't complain, you can't operate anymore on what the university does. Now, what's happened in the last generation, at least, and more, has been the capitalization of the private university, of the public university. The public university has come to look more and more like the private university, a neoliberal university, as our colleague David Green says. And it seems to me that privatization is just one more slightly formal step in that direction. in the direction that American education is going, American higher education is going anyhow.
Yeah, think how far we've come from the mid-19th century idea of an agricultural and mechanical university, excuse me, that would serve the entire state, be for the benefit of all the citizens of the state. And now, well, people might still doff their hat to that verbally, theoretically, but the money spent on higher education is no longer viewed as social capital or human capital.
Right.
It's viewed as spending.
There you go. You're watching News from Neptune. We are talking about the little university down the street from Urbana Public Television. And we've turned perhaps to another question, Karen?
Yeah, I really think talking about the university would be better when David Green is here in place of me, because he has a lot more to say on that topic than I do. I just know that you're quite right in that they have been targeting foreign students of recent just because they bring in more money. And they're less apt to be politically active, too. So you get a dual, yes, because the fear of losing your visa, which it's a legitimate fear, even though it happens quite rarely, extremely rarely.
Have you either of you heard about what's going on in Quebec?
Yes.
A student strike there?
Oh, yeah. Oh, those Quebec students, yes. They have a real history there. I wanted to turn to well, given now our involvement with, I shouldn't say given now our involvement in Yemen, but because we've been involved in Yemen for a very long time, but now that it's quite open that how much we're bombing and killing and involved in regime change. So I was looking up Jeremy Scahill's Dirty Wars, which most people have seen the film, but his book, I mean, it's very detailed.
Hold that up and let the camera see that,
Yes.
because this is a very important book.
It really is. It's chock full of details of almost everything you want to know that's going on in the Middle East is here. And I came across, I was looking up to get more of a history on Yemen, and there's no question that it's been our involvement that has stirred everything up and created a lot of problems. But what's most interesting to me is how you'll still come across a little paragraph that you think is not related, but of course it is. And this one here was talking about how, again, about how the military, and Mark Mazzetti reported this. Mark Mazzetti writes for the New York Times, but he's a highly credible writer of books.
In spite of writing for the New York
Times. In spite
Times.
of writing for, yes. And one of the things he says is about, unlike covert actions undertaken by the CIA, such clandestine activity does not require the president's approval or regular reports to Congress. And who was, anyway, but Mark was able to read some of these orders, and it really clearly comes out with the fact that the Pentagon was, the order spoke, I want to talk about this order that the Pentagon came up with. Under the Bush administration, the Pentagon regularly justified clandestine special ops by insisting that the forces were not at war, but rather preparing for the battlefield. And this was to be continued. This was in 2009 ex-ord by Petraeus, and solidified the Bush-era justification for expanding covert wars under President Obama. And then it continues. So for anybody who has any doubt that what Obama is continuing, the Bush wars, I mean, this stuff, you can't make this stuff up. It's documented and credible, and it shows who's really leading the troops would be the Pentagon.
I think the American involvement in the Middle East is consistent over time, consistent in the Obama and Bush administrations. Any notion that things were different in the Bush years from what they are now needs justification, and it's usually not available. But the present situation where Saudi Arabia is attacking Yemen and even preparing, apparently, troops on the ground in Yemen, as they say, along with the cooperation of the Gulf Cooperation Council, and is an example of this ongoing American policy. Saudi Arabia has been the principal agent of American policy in the Middle East, second only to Israel, for many a year. In fact, American policy in the Middle East represents or is represented by the actions of Saudi Arabia and Israel. It's U.S. policy. It's being put in place by Saudi Arabia and Israel. I thought this was brought out particularly when the announcement of the Saudi Arabian attack on Yemen this week, attack from the air so far, was made not in Riyadh, nor in any other, in a Middle Eastern capital at all, but in Washington. And the announcement was made by the Saudi ambassador to Washington that this action had been undertaken. I mean, you know, is this okay, Dad? Is you know, can I do this? I mean, it was sort of the way it
They're
was
not
presented.
even attempting. They're not. There's no attempt anymore to even cover it up. I don't.
Exactly.
Think. It's so out in the open.
But actually, there is an attempt to cover it up from the only enemy that the American government really fears,
Right.
That is the American populace.
Yeah.
And so the way that's presented in the media is that Saudi Arabia is opposing a rebel takeover in Yemen.
Yeah.
Now,
Right.
what that doesn't say is that the United States, providing what Henry Kissinger used to call the overall framework of order, has its droog, the Saudi government, do its work for it. And the way to understand this is to see that the U.S. has developed and indeed encouraged a divide and rule arrangement in the Middle East that puts the Saudis and their allies, including Israel, on one side, and Iran and their allies on the other side. We talk about this as a Sunni-Shia division, and it is that, but it's not over details of Islamic theology. It's on the different rivalries of power in the region, where the U.S. uses the existing power relations for its own purposes. And it's particularly interesting right now because the U.S. is trying actively to reincorporate Iran into its overall framework of order in the Middle East. At the same time, Iranian allies and Saudi allies are at war with one another, which is also perfectly appropriate in the carrot and stick approach that the U.S. takes to the region. There's no way to talk about the people who are being killed in Yemen right now without talking about American policy and what American policy is doing in the region as a whole.
I'd like to mention a book, another book related.
Go ahead.
Okay. This is by Dr. Robert Gould, and it's called Body Count, whereby he talks about the highest, it's as high as 1.3 million per people killed, and it goes up to as many as 2 million people killed. Now this is based upon our war in Iraq, and that includes Afghanistan and Pakistan. So these details are out, and he has detailed it quite a bit in this book, which is to be recommended.
Yeah, I think Americans sometimes we keep hear about war and rumors of war in the Middle East, and we don't really reflect on the fact that from the point of view of the rest of the world, what's happened is that American actions and an immense amount of American money has gone into killing perhaps 2 million people in the Middle East in the last decade. Now, I mean, think of another area in the world where 2 million people could be killed by foreign military force, and it would not be noticed. For American media, for the most part, this is a question of whether, Democrats and Republicans are arguing about Benghazi or something, not about the overall policy of the United States in the region.
Yeah.
Well, CNN, every time I walk into the room with CNN on, all I see is about this plane crash, and the co-pilot didn't let the pilot into the cockpit. I'm not really sure, but they're making it look like it's the most enormous occurrence that has happened. And all of this,
Pretty enormous for the people on the plane, I guess.
Well,
but,
it was, of course, but they're just non-stop focusing on every little detail about this. It's almost like this scintillating drama taking place for people. And I think, so nobody really knows anything else that's going on.
Well, that's
in
the
the
big
world
thing
right now.
in the news, the media. It drives out everything else. And
Yeah.
there's this intense interest which will fade within 3 or 4 days, and then they'll move on to a new sensation.
Yeah, and they don't lighten on the what I call the gory details. I mean, if I had a relative who died in this plane crash, I don't want to hear about how everything was smashed, and they do that now yeah. So no, I'm serious. They do it nicely, but they're still doing it, and to me, it shouldn't be done.
Can you compare the dispute about the torture photos and the reporting on the actual effects of, say, the Israeli attacks on Gaza, the way in which the media are sanitized as far as those things are concerned,
Oh,
even to the point of
definitely.
not showing the coffins of Americans killed
Right.
in the Middle East
Right.
being brought home, as was true during the Bush administration. I think it's probably still true
Yeah.
in the Obama administration. I mean, there are some things that Americans aren't supposed to pay attention to the reality of, so to speak, and part of it are the casualties of the wars that we're producing.
Well, isn't it because a lot of people have this attitude that Karen has? I don't want to see unpleasant things.
Well, that's
I don't
true.
have that attitude.
Particularly,
Oh, okay.
I'm the opposite. I don't want to
particularly
hear the gory details about an accident, because I think that's offensive to the family. But when it comes to war, I'm just the opposite. I want all the details, and I post them, and I don't care who I offend.
And it makes a difference on what we're responsible for, it seems
Exactly.
to me. It's so long as we can wash our hands of responsibility of what the U.S. is doing in the Mideast, don't trouble us with pictures of dead children.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. You're watching News from Neptune. We have some other topics to cover. Ron, do you have something else you want to go back to?
Well, this question about charter schools and how they're different comes up again today in the New York Times Online. And should the funding of these schools and public schools be increased or decreased, and so on? And the point keeps coming up, especially by our conservative friends, that more money doesn't mean that the schools are better, that they're more productive. These people, this is a widespread problem apparently, completely unable to distinguish between necessary and sufficient conditions. And of course, more money doesn't necessarily mean that the schools will be better, whatever you think better means. But it does follow that if they have less money, they will be worse.
No. And I was on the board of directors of an international school, and they built a new school charging a huge, huge amount for it. And I was able to meet with the UN, get them to take over the old building. And at the end of the day, that school in the old building has really soared with the academic scores because their focus is on academics, while the international school, the American school, was focused on sports and fun and entertainment, and of course it was all about property development in the area, and their scores aren't nearly as high. And yet they get, and most of the teachers are American and they're on a circuit, and so they're well paid, but it's just the idea that education isn't about buildings, swimming pools, that sort of thing. So
Well,
the charter
it's become that.
schools, well, that's what, right.
Also
so
at the
I saw
collegiate
it-
level.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
More and more colleges are trying to look like country clubs.
Yeah.
And they have their athletic spectacles and their weight loss rooms and their spas and on and on.
Yeah.
And some people are starting to object to that. But hey, shouldn't we be educating the whole child?
Well, that's right. Right. Can I mention something
How are the
here?
local student athletes doing, by
Yeah.
the way?
Yeah, I have
We
no
haven't
idea.
looked at
Right.
them,
Yeah.
They've fallen on hard times on the basketball court at least.
But the debate about private schools and charter schools in particular revolves around this question of what some are calling productivity. And this harkens back to the old line about efficiency in the schools, back to Taylorism, as it used to be called, and how do we become more efficient, looking at the schools from a cost-benefit standpoint. How do we figure out what the costs are and what the benefits are, and so on, and how do we maximize the ratio of benefits to costs? And this is turning education over to the industrial engineering people, which will land you quickly into that kind of thinking. And it seems to me a terrible distortion. Another thing they're not taking into account is the much greater ease with which private schools and charter schools in particular can suspend or expel students. In the public schools, that's very difficult to do. It's theoretically possible. But there are a whole lot of very recalcitrant and defiant students out there, especially in the public schools. And if you start comparing the achievements of private schools to public schools, you have to take that into account. That in a private school or in a charter school, to a large extent, if someone becomes troublesome, you can say, out.
It's a good point. Like
Yeah.
student debt, it's another way to keep to
Right.
make a docile student body,
Right.
which American society has been spending a lot of concern on in the last generation. They found another way to do it.
Can I
Karen,
bring
you
up?
had something else you wanted? Yes.
I have a lot of things, but
Okay.
they're kind of all over the place. I saw an interview on the Charlie Rose show, which I haven't been watching at all lately. But he
I
interviewed
can
Lee Kuan
understand that.
Yew.
I can understand that.
Okay, but he interviewed Lee Kuan Yew over many years.
Uh-huh.
Now, I have never been a fan of Lee Kuan Yew.
You should
who was
point out who he is.
He recently passed away at age 91. He was the Prime Minister of Singapore. And even though I've been to Singapore at least 3 times, if not more than that, and it's a very, very impressive city-state, I think is what they refer to it. But I also knew that they have very strict laws. And Lee Kuan Yew is, we used to call him the benevolent dictator, but he is a dictator. What I did note, though, now, of course, he was defending himself. They do execute drug. I've mentioned this before. If you're caught, I think it's over 10 grams, I think, of just about anything you bring into the country, it's the death penalty. And they do not have jury trials. They have trial by judges. Because he says, to him, drugs, it destroys the individual, the family, and the whole clan. But, and I'm opposed to capital punishment, so I'm not pleased to hear that. And I know that his opposition, whenever he's had opposition, I think they spend time in jail. That's it. And we know that they cane Western teenagers who are unruly and do graffiti and things like that. Public cane,
There
not
was a
public.
scandal about that a
Right.
few years ago.
Oh, they're
Some Western
off and on,
teenager
all the time.
was being caned. And
Yeah, and it's happening right now. They've got another ones who did graffiti and stuff. No, this is well known, and we know when we're in Singapore, we don't spit or put chewing gum on the sidewalks. I mean, it's kind of a joke. But you have to understand.
Oh, they were serious about it.
They did the same thing in China. He did it in Singapore, and I saw Hong Kong following suit, whereby on TV they would have these little ads, and they would actually do it through the announcement speakers, telling people, not to walk around outdoors in your pajamas, not to spit on the sidewalk, not to chew gum. I mean,
the big issue some time ago,
not
I understood, was
not
people
slipping-
urinating in the elevators.
Oh, that was the big one in Singapore. And he said they had to put up cameras because he said people were still doing it in the elevators. And he said then you have these people, the dissidents, they figured that out, so they would go outside the elevator and urinate into the elevator. Obviously, they were men. So he said, in order to defeat that, he said we put the cameras outside of the elevators and finally cured it. But as a leader, I thought for
That's
the first
politics for you.
time,
Yeah.
right? But for the first time, I opened my mind a little bit to some of the accomplishments he did make. Not only is Singapore a green oasis, it really is. It's clean, it's green, it's clean. I mean, they plant lots of trees everywhere. The other thing is that they have housing. The people own their own homes. And his goal was to have a certain equality. He said, yes, you have the millionaires, okay? But he said the vast middle class, we don't have this poverty. He said, you will not find any street anywhere in Singapore where you see the poor. He said, everyone owns their home. But he said, what else we had to do, because they're mixed. They have Chinese, they have Malaysians, they have Indians. So he said, in order to prevent instability, he said, we had to have quotas. Now, I'm somebody who's always been sort of opposed to certain quotas. I like positive quotas, and his were positive quotas whereby we had to mix the community. We had to have, okay, Chinese, Malay, and Indians living together on the same street in the same community, working together, because he said otherwise we knew, and I know this for a fact, if you don't do that, they will have their own communities, their own, and they will stay clannish and be in opposition to one another. So it's a form of integration. That is what they did. He imposed integration on the people. And from what I understand, it's been very effective. So I'm not an expert on Singapore, but I just found it interesting that in hearing some of the ideas, because you have to remember, he would have liked to have stayed had Singapore remained part of Malaysia. But that, and his how he came to power was he was one of those who fought against the British rule. And then he did get his education. He said he came from a comfortable family. I have to look more into it. But for years and years, I have, like my husband, anybody who was Chinese right away, oh, Lee Kuan Yew, oh, yes, the wonderful leader, because he did so much for Singapore. And in fact, Lee Kuan Yew, he mentions how it was Deng Xiaoping, when he visited Singapore, he went away with certain ideas that, okay, this is what we're going to do in China. Now, I'm not a fan of Deng Xiaoping, because he introduced capitalism, or what we call a mixed market economy, into China. And that did hurt a lot of people. However, China has progressed as a result, at least economically somewhat. So, but he talks about the synergy effect of Deng Xiaoping seeing some of the things that they did in Singapore. So it brought me to think to myself that maybe I need to take another look at someone who I've just immediately, from a leftist perspective, from a humanitarian perspective, right away, anybody mention Lee Kuan Yew, oh, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to know anything about it. Don't talk to me about it. And I say this because some of the Burmese exiles, when they were reading books and buying books about how when we get to be in charge of our country back in Burma one day, these are young students, what pattern do we follow, or who do we emulate? And they were reading books about Lee Kuan Yew and what he had done. And my Western friends and I were kind of like, oh, no, you don't want to do that. And we were really putting it down. But I thought sometimes you can, and I think, Carl, you pointed this out, sometimes you have to look at people that you think of as your opponent. Like in what we should do now is try to look at what libertarians are saying. I never thought I'd be looking at the Ron Paul Institute when it comes to foreign policy. So I just wanted to bring that up, that I just had this sort of awakening to some of the things Lee Kuan Yew has done.
Actually, I'd like to take up the libertarian line there for a moment and refer to some contemporary events. I began the program tonight by talking about the limits of allowable debate in American politics, and about the way that both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, are both neoliberal and neoconservative, and that this is a relatively recent political formation, and it flies in the face of the notion of we have a liberal party and a conservative party, and that they are debating the best way forward, so to speak. If that was ever true, it certainly is not now. Both parties are neoliberal and neoconservative. Right. But there is nevertheless an interesting division in one of the formal parties in the United States, the Republicans, not in the Democrats, interestingly enough, where the smoothness of the neoliberal neoconservative mix reigns from runs the gamut from A to B, as was famously said. The Democratic Party, in other words, is pretty uniformly neoliberal and neoconservative. The Democratic Party is uniformly neoliberal and neoconservative. The Republican Party, however, does have a division that Karen just mentioned, and that is to the Ron Paul wing of the party, a wing of the party of the Republican Party that is upsetting to as many Republicans as it is to Democrats, not just because of its peculiar economic ideas, but even more importantly, perhaps, for its foreign policy ideas. Ron Paul, the senior member of the family, has for a long time called for the withdrawal of American troops from abroad. He's called for an end to the interventions that have cost the 2 million lives that we were talking about earlier in the program, and the billions and billions of dollars spent by the Obama and Bush administrations. He's opposed that. He wants those troops brought home. He's against the only real anti-war movement in American politics and formal American politics is in this peculiar wing of the Republican Party. And for a while, some people thought that Ron Paul's son, Senator Rand Paul, would be speaking for this non-interventionist wing of the party in the run-up to the 2016 presidential election. Anybody who thought that now has probably been disabused of that notion. And in the middle of this week, Senator Rand Paul made a move in the Senate to cut funding for global poverty fighting programs and use the money instead to buy weapons and send them to the Ukraine. In fact, the matter is under consideration for a Senate vote this week. This occurred with an amendment that Senator Paul offered to the budget resolution in the Senate, the amendment introduced Wednesday called for nearly $190 billion to be added to the defense budget, which is already the largest part of the budget, a 16% increase. And in order to pay for that, he wants to stop various programs that would fight poverty in the rest of the world. And it's quite remarkable. It's quite a turnaround from the positions that his father took, and certainly a long way from the hopes that some people had that we would actually have a presidential candidate who opposed the Bush-Obama wars. It looks like not happening.
Another bad sign today, New York Times, John Bolton, former UN ambassador.
Yes.
Always a bad sign.
Always a bad sign. Anything
starts
to
say we should start bombing Iran now.
Yep, that's right.
God.
Avoid the rush later.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, we've sent the Saudis to bomb Yemen,
Yeah.
and after all, the notion is that what's going on in Yemen is really just an Iranian advance anyhow in the mythology of American politics. So, yeah, let's get at it. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 13th week of 2015, a Limits of Allowable Debate edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been Aram and Ron Szoke. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. There's a new column in the online magazine Smile Politely under the name of this program, News from Neptune. This week on political science, next week on free speech, and there are pieces in the local daily as well, the newspaper, from Neptuners on neoliberalism and Obama's war. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.